Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. Please say hello to my new best friend. It's this, the Uno Synth Pro X from IK Multimedia. So I've had this synth for a few months, and I have to say, in all honesty, it's very difficult to put it down. It's very, very addictive. It's a huge amount of fun to play around with. It sounds absolutely wonderful. It's incredibly feature-packed. It's an analog monosynth that does paraphonic mode really well. It's got some wonderful effects as well, and the price is just ridiculously competitive. I really honestly do think that this synth is one of the most underrated products out there on the market right now. Certainly one of the most underrated monosynths, analog synths on the market right now. So a lot that I'm going to talk about with the Uno Synth Pro X is equally relevant to the rest of the Uno Synth Pro range of synthesizers. That's because they all share the exact same synth engine. But let's get on with the first thing I love about the Uno Synth Pro X, and that is its oscillators. And here we have three analog oscillators. They are identical analog oscillators, and I'll get on to why I think that's a big deal in a minute. But three analog oscillators in a monosynth is really not very common. Most analog synthesizers have two oscillators maximum. Now, something I really love about these oscillators in the Uno Synth Pro X is the wave shape control. We have a continuously variable wave shape control, exactly the same as we have in a Mini Moog Voyager. The Mini Moog Voyager, the wave shape goes from triangle all the way around to sawtooth, and then square wave, and then pulse wave, and we have the exact same control with the Uno Synth Pro X, and we can modulate the wave shape. Now, unlike on a Voyager, where you can only modulate the wave shape across all the oscillators at the same time, with the Uno Synth Pro X we can modulate the wave shapes individually for each oscillator, and I'll talk about modulations a little bit later on in the video. Now, what's the big deal about these analog oscillators all being identical? Well, the Uno Synth Pro X is capable of playing paraphonically. It's capable of playing 3 notes at the same time and allocating 1 oscillator to each note. Now, the kind of sounds that I'm making with this synth all the time are really kind of mimicking a polysynth. If you want to have the exact same waveforms, exact same modulations, and play the paraphonic nature of the synth like a polysynth, then you really want those 3 oscillators to be identical, and that is what we have with the Uno Synth Pro X, and I really do love it. The second thing I love about the Uno Synth Pro X are its filters. Both of them. 2 beautiful sounding analog filters. Both of these filters are resonant filters, but filter number 1 is switchable between high pass and low pass mode, whereas filter number 2 is switchable between 2-pole and 4-pole mode. So we have a huge amount of flexibility with these 2 filters, and we can apply them in flexible ways. By default, they are applied in series, but with this little button here, we can change them to parallel. Now, if you think about it, when you combine a high pass filter and a low pass filter, put them together in series, then we can create band pass filter effects, and if we combine them in parallel, we can create notch filter effects. Now, to make this really easy to use with real-time control, we can link the cutoffs of the 2 filters, and we can also link the resonance controls of the 2 filters. Right, so this is the part of the video where I have a little bit of negativity. Literally, there is only one criticism that I can level against this synthesizer. So I'll talk about it now in this section. And basically, my criticism is about the envelopes, or specifically about one thing about the envelopes, and that is the decay phase of the envelopes. It is really quite short. I'll give you a demonstration of what I'm talking about just in a second. But I'm trying to wonder why that is, and I honestly do think that in the synth world, in the synth community, we are a little bit over obsessed with snappy envelopes. All I see is snappy envelopes. Synthesizers seem to be judged by the snappiness of their envelopes, which I find rather bizarre. However, I do think that maybe IK Multimedia have concentrated so much on getting the snappiest possible envelopes of all time inside this synth that they've actually kind of taken their eye off the ball about the use of those envelopes for all styles of music. So what we've got here is a really lovely long attack phase, a lovely long release phase for these envelopes, but the decay phase, for me personally, is just way too short. I'm sure it's something that could be sorted out in firmware. Maybe they could give us an option to switch between short and long, but for me right now it is the only major criticism that I have of this synthesizer. I'll show you now, or play for you now, a little demonstration so you can see what I'm talking about. So my criticism of the envelopes to one side, let's just talk about the modulation capabilities of the Uno Synth Pro and Uno Synth Pro X. And the modulation capabilities are extensive. So we have 3 envelope generators: filter envelope, amplifier envelope, and then a third envelope. Those 3 envelope generators are freely assignable within the mod matrix. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, as well as being ADSR, attack, decay, sustain and release phase envelopes, we can also loop them, so we can use them as a kind of a complex waveform LFO, if you like, and we've also got control over when those envelopes trigger. Next, let's talk about LFOs. There are 2 of them. We have a wide variety of waveforms to choose from: sine, triangle, the 2 styles of sawtooth, square, random, sample and hold, and noise coming from the LFOs. We've got the ability to fade in the LFO, so obviously we've got control over retriggering them as well. And in terms of that fade in, we've actually got control over how it fades in. We've got control over the fade in curve. We can specify linear, logarithmic or exponential, and we can synchronize our LFOs to clock. And finally, let's talk about the mod matrix. It's really easy to program. You simply choose a source, a destination, and an amount. It's as simple as that. We have 16 slots in the matrix, a whole load of sources and destinations. I can't remember exactly how many. It's almost 30 sources and well over 30 destinations. And in there you've got things like, well, I actually haven't mentioned, but on the back of the synth you've got physical CV and gate inputs and outputs, so you can drive those, input them into the mod matrix, and send values out of the mod matrix to those CV and gates. We've got things like the FX parameters as modulation destinations, and as well as all of that, we've actually got modulation slots as destinations for our modulations, so we can modulate our modulations. And that is how you would program, for example, using the mod wheel or aftertouch or whatever it is you want to actually affect an existing modulation that you set up in the mod matrix. It's really, really flexible, really, really easy to use. I really do like it. So the next feature about the Uno Synth Pro X that I really do love, that I want to cover in this section of the video, is its sequencer. And it really does surprise me to be able to be saying that, because I just generally don't use the inbuilt sequencers that come with synthesizers and keyboards. You know, I do all my composition here in my studio. I have my DAW right in front of me. Why do I need to use a little sequencer on a synthesizer? Certainly a synthesizer of this price range, because I'm really expecting the sequencer to be very, very basic. However, IK Multimedia have put into this sequencer some capabilities that are really well thought out, really useful, and a lot of fun to use. So I thought what I'd do in this section of the video is just cover those features, the things about the sequencer that I really do love, and what I'm saying here is appropriate not just to the Uno Synth Pro X, but also to the rest of the Uno Synth Pro range, because the sequencer is the same. So that's what's coming up now, sequencing with the Uno Synth Pro X. Right, so sequencing, where to start? Let's just talk about the basics first of all. It looks pretty standard on the front panel. We have these 16 sequencer steps, but we do actually have 4 pages of them, or up to 4 pages of them, and these are the page buttons. So we've actually got a 64 step sequencer. We can do all the normal things that you'd expect from a sequencer. We can set the swing amount, the gate length, we can record note data on each of the steps, but we can also record parameter changes throughout the synth engine as well. But apart from the basics, let's talk about a few of the interesting features that the sequencer has. So as well as adding note data and parameter values to the steps, we can also add an accent to the steps. Let's just have a go at that. So here I've got a rather moody little bass line going on. Let's add some accents. So you can see with that setting of accents, we could either bake those accents into the sequence, or we could just play around with them in a live performance. And talking of live performance, one thing that we can do with the sequencer is transpose it on the fly. Let me give you an example of that. So here I've got a little sequence playing. Let's go into transpose mode. Now I've mentioned that you can store note data against each step. That's pretty obvious, but actually this is a polyphonic sequencer. You can store multiple notes against each step, and if you think about it, because this is a paraphonic synth and you can play 3 notes at the same time, having a sequencer that supports multiple notes per step is really, really useful. Here is a little sequence which you will have heard a couple of times already in this video. You'll see by the little lights and the little mini keyboard there that every other step is playing a 3-note chord. So we can see what notes are stored against each step by just holding it down. And if you look at the display up there, we'll see first note, its velocity and its length. Second note, its value, its velocity, its length. and the third note, its value, its velocity and its length, because each of those notes that's recorded on this step can have its own separate velocity and length. It is a truly polyphonic sequencer. So I've said that each sequence is stored in a preset. So each preset has one sequence. It's very, very normal for synthesizers that have sequencers on board to do this kind of thing. But what happens if you're playing a sequence and you switch presets? Let's see what happens, because this for me is a big surprise, and it's where the magic and the power of the Uno Synth Pro X really kicks in. Here I've got a sequence or preset and a sequence playing. Let's switch to another preset. It's a very subtly different sequence, and a subtly different sound. It doesn't matter when I choose to switch, the timing is synchronized. It waits, the synth waits until the end of the sequence and then seamlessly switches to the next preset. So this really does open up the synth to real-time tweaking and live performance. You can queue up basically your next preset with its sequence and play it perfectly in timing. Now, that real-time synchronized switching between presets doesn't just stop there. It's far more powerful than that, because the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that when I choose to switch to a different preset, I get a choice. Let me show you that. I'll go to a different preset that I want to play, and when I choose it by pressing this control, I get a load option here. Do I want to load the sound and the sequence together for the new preset? Or do I just want to load the sound and leave the sequence alone, the one that's playing? Or do I want to leave the sound that's playing alone and just load the new sequence? And this is really, really very, very cool. So here I'm going to just load a different sound but keep this sequence playing. Let's see what happens. So I'm playing the sound from preset number 212, but I'm playing the sequence that I had originally with preset 245. Let's go back to 245 and load its sound. And when I do it, it's going to wait till the end of the sequence before it loads that sound. Now, an interesting thing that I've noticed is, and I think it's a bug, but the tempo for the preset is stored as part of the sound parameters and not the sequence. That doesn't make any sense at all. However, it is an interesting bug, because let me switch to a different sound on another preset. I'm just going to load the sound. We're still playing the same sequence as before, but we've got the new sound and we've got a slightly different tempo. Let's have another go. Now, tempo changes aside, and obviously we have full control over the tempo. We can set whatever tempo we like when we store a preset. But those changes aside, this is an incredibly powerful feature. A very powerful feature for playing live performance or just having fun and, you know, noodling about and switching between different sequences, trying out different sounds. It's a load of fun, and this for me was a big surprise to see how much power there is in this tiny little box. Right, so everything I've been talking about so far with the Uno Synth Pro X has been equally applicable to the rest of the Uno Synth Pro range, the previous models in that range. Because I've been talking about the synth engine, I've been talking about the sequencer, and those things are identical across all the different models. However, what I'm going to talk about next, which I really do love about the Uno Synth Pro X, is unique to the Uno Synth Pro X, because I'm going to be talking about the user interface. Now, I've owned the Uno Synth Pro in terms of the previous models. I've owned them from the very beginning. I first got the little tiny desktop version. I then upgraded to the slightly bigger version that's got the full-size keys. And I love the sound of those synthesizers, and I did use them a bit, but not a lot. And I thought that the user interface was perfectly fine. You know, you've got the menu system. It's a very intuitive menu system. You've got a little matrix where you can, you know, set values for common parameters. I thought the interface was fine, but in reality, looking back, I didn't really use those synthesizers very much, whereas the Uno Synth Pro X, as I said at the beginning of the video, I can't put it down. I'm using it all the time, and it must be the user interface that is the difference for me. It's an incredibly clear, straightforward, intuitive, and very cleverly thought out user interface, and I do really think that IK Multimedia should be winning awards for this synthesizer. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. So it's a very small form factor, there's not a lot of room there, yet the controls are very clear, very clearly labeled. There's enough space around them. They're not too small, they're not too big. There's enough space around them. It's a very usable interface. And the choices that have been made with that user interface have been very, very smart. I'll give you an example. So over on the left hand side we have the oscillator section. Now we've only got controls there to control one oscillator at a time. You have to use the little button to select which oscillator you want to control. The oscillators, as I've mentioned already, are identical to each other. They are identical VCOs, but you have to select the one that you want to fiddle with, and that's absolutely fine. There's absolutely there's no time that I've ever needed two hands to be able to tweak the fine tune of one oscillator at the same time as the tuning of another oscillator. It's absolutely fine to choose with a button which oscillator I want to control and then control it. It works for me. Whereas, contrast that to the filter section. We have two filters. We've got filter 1 there, you can see on the left, filter 2 on the right, and they've given us controls for both filters on the front panel. And that's because over and over again, when you do have two filters at your disposal, you're going to want to tweak the cutoffs or tweak the resonances of those filters at the same time to get the sound that you want, whether you're running the filters in series or in parallel. So they've really thought about this. You know, someone who is actually used to designing patches and building sounds has had input into the design of this user interface. In terms of the envelopes, you select which envelope you want to control before you fiddle around with the controls. Yes, it would be nice to have the multiple controls for, you know, for the amp envelope and the filter envelope at the same time, but there's just not enough room on this size of instrument, and so I get it, and it works fine. It's never been a problem for me. Same thing with the LFOs. You select which LFO and then you control it. The effects, again, you know, you don't need to be controlling multiple effects at exactly the same time. You've got a little select button to select which effects that you want, and the choice of effects and how the controls work to change the effects parameters is really intuitive and works very well. And then at the bottom of the synth, you've got this tiny little, you've got this tiny little keyboard, 1 octave keyboard there with tiny little keys. Reminds me of a little Electron Analog 4 kind of keyboard. It works perfectly well for punching in values to save in the sequencer, and it works perfectly well for kind of previewing the sounds that you're working on. It's not there to be played, but it's there to be used, and it's very functional and it works really well. And then of course you've got the standard sort of steps across the bottom there, the 16 steps for the sequencer. I think the whole thing has been incredibly well thought out. For the space that's available, it just works really well, and it's so important to have a user interface onto an instrument that you're going to end up using a lot, that works for you, that you don't have to think too hard about. You know, there are some shift functions going on in there, but everything is clearly labeled on the front panel, and it's intuitive. It's intuitive to use, and I've had so much fun with this synthesizer, for the most part because of the user interface. Because if the user interface was wearing and tiring and unintuitive, I just would end up not using the synth as much as I have done. Right, so that's the end of this video. Any conclusions that I can draw? This is just an incredibly fun, easy to use, intuitive and wonderful sounding little analog monosynth. It does paraphonic mode really very, very well. You can create some incredibly wonderful pads and chords out of this thing. You know, I know we all love to surround ourselves with vintage, wonderful monophonic synthesizers, but to be perfectly honest with you, if I had to strip back everything, sell everything, and I didn't have the cash for anything else, then I'd be very, very happy to have this little monosynth in my studio. It really is very, very capable. That's it. Thank you very, very much for watching. I'm just going to play you out with one more little example of some of the sounds coming out of this. Like all the other examples that I've shown you in this video, it is just made up of little sequences that I've created on the Synth Pro X and then put them together to create a little tune. And this for me has been very, very inspirational to create tracks. So what you'll hear with this track that I'm just about to play you is there's a little bit of guitar going on in it and obviously some drums as well, but ultimately it's just little Synth Pro X sequences put together. I hope you enjoy it. Until the next one, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.